Welcome, Mustang Hockey alumni and friends, to the 5th edition of our virtual Hot Stove series. This year, we're very pleased to have you back with us tonight. We have an incredibly special guest tonight, and as always, our host, Ryan Robinson, will be asking the questions, running the Q&A from his home studio in North London. But tonight, we bring to you Bob Stauffer. I have known Bob since the late 90s. Bob, I met him. He was the sports information director at the University of Alberta. So I'll warn you, he does bleed a little bit green and yellow, but he's not with the Golden Bears anymore. Bob has moved on and had an incredibly successful career in radio and television broadcasting. Bob runs a drive show in Edmonton daily called Oilers Now, and as well he's a color commentator for Oilers Sportsnet broadcast. So we're so pleased to have Bob with us tonight. He's going to talk a lot about U Sport, Alberta, Western, obviously the Oilers, maybe some Golden Bear history, as well as answer any of your questions near the end of the show. And I will remind you that, as we approach the 45-minute mark, 8:45 here Eastern time, you're welcome to chat in your questions for Ryan, and he'll make sure they get up and for Bob to answer. So without further ado, very, very pleased to bring Bob along. And ironically, I did see Bob on Saturday in Calgary. We hadn't seen each other for quite a while, but saw each other at pregame skate and chatted with them a little bit by text message. So Bob, welcome. We're very happy to have you tonight.
Thanks, Clark. You guys must be really reaching at the bottom of the barrel here to grab a guy from Alberta due to conversation on Western hockey. I'm pretty sure at one point there was a Martinelli connection as well. I think he might have spent some time out in Western Canada at one stage prior to coming aboard at Western as well. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know Barry's. He might have. I know that one of my former assistants, longtime assistant coach, Cam O'Donnell, worked with the Golden Bears. He did his, I believe he did his PhD at Alberta. So he knows Eric Thurston and Rob Dahm and some of those folks from the late 80s, early 90s. And actually, I met Eric this week when I was out recruiting. So I had lunch with him in Drayton Valley. So it was great to catch up with Eric. He's very successful out there coaching in the AJHL.
Yeah, he's had an interesting run. He had 6 years at the U of A and won 2 national titles and 5 conference titles, but ultimately was moved along. And I would say he's grossly overqualified to be coaching in junior A hockey. I mean, he probably should be a major junior coach. I hope he gets that opportunity again.
Yeah. Now, was he the head coach of the Golden Bears at all?
Yeah, he was. So what happened is Rob Dahm went to Houston in the American Hockey League in 2005. And so U of A hosted in 04-05 and 05-06. That's when Pete Beliveau had some pretty good teams with Lakehead.
Right.
I'm trying to think. You guys came to Nationals in 04-05, didn't you? Were you there that year?
We did, yeah. We played Moncton. I know we played Moncton.
You were in the Moncton
and Sask. We played Moncton and Sask.
Yeah, and Saskatchewan had a big physical team, and they pounded the snot out of Moncton. And then they played you guys basically to go to the gold medal game. And that was and then Alberta ended up playing Saskatchewan in the final. It was the last game Rob Dahm was the head coach for in front of 11,000 fans. It was the year of the lockout. And the Bears ended up rallying from a 3-1 deficit and beating Dave Adolph in Saskatchewan 4-3 in overtime. A guy named Ben Thompson scored the game-tying goal with about 30 seconds left. He got an American Hockey League contract a year later. And then in 05-06, that was Eric's first year, and he won a national title that year. Bears got upset in 06-07, and there was only one Canada West team that year in Nationals. They lost the conference final. And then my last year doing the Bears was 07-08. That was Eric's third year, and UNB went undefeated during the regular season, and the Bears beat them 3-2 in the national final out in Moncton. So Eric won 2 national titles in his first 3 years, and then they made it. They had a real good team in 2010, and they lost to St. Mary's in overtime that year as well.
Right. That was in Thunder Bay?
That was in Thunder Bay, yeah, because we I called in a favor to at that time, our owner had a company called Rexall Sports, Daryl Cates, and I had somebody involved with that organization pay to fly our radio guys from the U of A there because they weren't going to be able to go just to experience that. And Alberta hit the crossbar in overtime, and unfortunately, St. Mary's came back down the ice and deflected one in tight and won. And Alberta went a little quiet for a few years, and then they got Ian Herbers. It was between Ian Herbers and Chris Knobloch. Some of the guys watching right now would probably know that Chris Knobloch was the head coach of Erie with Connor McDavid. Chris is the only coach in major junior history to have 4 50-plus win seasons, and those were the 2 finalists for the Bears job in 2012.
Wow.
And Herbers ended up getting the job. He was on the 92 national championship team and later played in the NHL. Knobloch applied for the job. Kootenay found out, and he took Kootenay to the Memorial Cup in 2011, and Kootenay was upset that he interviewed, so they relieved him of his duties. And probably in early November of that year, Kevin Lowe called me and said, "Bob, do you think you can convince Chris Knobloch to go to Erie?" And I'm like, "Well, isn't that where McDavid is?" And he goes, "Yeah." And I go, "Well, what's our connection to Erie?" And we had loaned Sherry Basson a lot of money, like north of $5 million. And part of it, to help him out financially, maybe to look at a potential shift of franchise locations. Erie had struggled a bit. Right. And turned out Sherry Basson's originally from Saskatchewan, and Knobloch was right up his alley. He went in there, and, from 13-14 on for the next 4 years, they were a powerhouse, and they don't have the advantages that the London Knights have. London deals from a bit of a stacked deck. We all know that's the case. Yeah. Erie has, Erie's got kids that don't want to go there because of school. Like Taylor Hall turned Erie down in his draft year. And so Rhino, and so it's one of those situations where it's funny how it works out. Herbers came to the U of A and then won back-to-back championships in 13-14 and 14-15. Then he was on the Oilers staff for 3 years, and now he's back. And I just talked about Eric being overqualified for the WHL. I'd suggest to you that Ian's probably an AHL caliber coach, coaching at the U of A, but they compensate guys very fairly at that institution.
Right. Well, Bob, I don't know what happened to Ryan, whether he had some technical
No,
difficulty.
he's right. He's right here.
Wow.
Ryan's just sitting back enjoying the conversation. It's like the side note of being the sports information guy, but only starting in like 2018. I'm just enjoying the history lesson a little bit. So then, if we get into a situation, that last national championship that went, okay for us to start, but not for everybody else to finish. But it went all right. So I enjoy those times when I can get a little extra few nuggets of information, sort of thing.
Well, Bob, before I turn you right over to Ryan, I will let you know that Kyle Pettit, our captain, was on one of those Erie teams with Connor McDavid.
Yeah.
And as you probably witnessed from the screen, Ryan is a diehard. Not only he bleeds purple, but he also bleeds a little red and white from Detroit. So
that's why I do it this way. I got J-Dub, but he's in the cup with the Red Wings. It works out perfectly.
And he's still stinging a little bit from that 11-2 loss to the Penguins the other night. And folks back at home, Bob was calling the 9-5 Oilers loss to Calgary the other night. So I'm sure Ryan and him will get into that. But, well, Ryan, why don't we start a little bit with late 90s, early 2000 Western Mustang hockey dominance of the Alberta Golden Bears, which led to a national championship. Before we get into the NHL stuff, why don't we get a little, make us feel good about that. So I'll let you guys loose.
Thanks, Clark. Appreciate it, my friend. And Clark is always far too nice to me. So we're still, when you were saying off the top, scraping the bottom of the barrel for guests, I always say to him that he was scraping the bottom of the barrel when he asked me to host this thing. So now we're into year 2.5 sort of thing. So Bob, nice to electronically meet you. I think that's basically how life works now. We're all e-meeting everybody. Yeah. First things first, coming off that element, I know you were saying when we were kind of talking email wise sort of thing, the early, exactly where Clark was talking about, that early 90s, early 2000s, the Mustang and U of A kind of back and forth. What are your fondest memories of those meetings sort of thing?
Well, Alberta had won back-to-back titles in Saskatchewan when they hosted, and that was in the old 16 format. They won in 99 and they won in 2000. They beat UQTR both years. And Alberta's program, there was some things that happened between Alberta and UQTR in the 91 national championship game. Alberta outshot them 41-19 and lost the game 7-2. And there was some terminology deployed on the ice, which is certainly not acceptable by today's standards. Alberta has never lost to UQTR since. They beat UQTR. I joke around with Danny Dubé, who does color for Montreal. He was the head coach of the Patriots at that time. They beat UQTR 9-1 the next year and chased the CIA Player of the Year, a guy by the name of Denis Desbiens. And Corey Clouston scored 4 goals for Alberta. He was on their 4th line. I did their team's games that year. That's how far back I go. So Alberta's priority was, if they're going to beat a team from the OUA, it was always to beat Three Rivers. Part of it was the way in which they played. Part of it, which was the verbosity of their language on the ice. They just didn't like them, And in Western's case, Alberta, the first year in 2000, like I said, 2001, the Bears had won back-to-back titles in 99 2000. The team was awful that year in Kitchener. I remember they got up in the second game, but they were sort of stunned that they lost. They'd gone 41-2 in the regular season. And I think Alberta had played with a degree of arrogance in that 5-3 loss to Western in 2001. In 2002, it was a true semifinal game. Alberta was better prepared. They outshot Western. I just looked it up, 38-17. Zhudazicki and Talbot were 2 of the better offensive players. They had a good goalie. And Clayton Poole had an awful game, gave up 4 goals on 17 shots. But I thought a lot of Alberta's play was to the perimeter. They got a lot of – the Corsi gods would have been happy. The analytics looked good in the game, but Alberta didn't really play well. So, and the problem was from 2001, 02, 03, and 04, the Bears went number 1 ranked to all 4 tournaments and lost. And there was a lot of heat on the program when they came back to Edmonton. We hosted in 05, 06. Bears were number 1 again both years that year and ended up winning the national title both years. But I just remember that Western was they were technically like Alberta. I think they played one of the other. I don't know who it was. They beat one of the other OUA schools 8-2 in their first game, and then had to play Western. And I remember we were watching the skate for the team that we were going to play the opening game against. And Rob Dahm, the head coach, looked at me and said, "Staff, I think you're better than their second line center." Now, the problem with that is I was 37 at the time and 235 pounds. But he just said, "Look at this guy is light in the ass. We're gonna eat these guys alive." And they did. They beat him 8-2, but it was a completely different feeling. I think from a structure and process perspective, nobody would ever debate how Western played. They're well coached, and talent-wise at that time, it was probably closer than now, in fairness, just because of scholarship cap limitations on the OUA schools. Alberta's players, every one of them is getting a full WHL scholarship, but also it gets matched by the U of A and their alumni. So, definitely, that's kind of where I got to meet Clark. I sat in on a couple of coaches' meetings. Then we hosted in 05, and Clark was in a pool with Western was in a pool with Saskatchewan and Moncton. The Huskies ended up winning the pool, and Saskatchewan was a big, physical, tough team. Like, relative to at that time CIS standards, like, they probably had 7 forwards that were north of 6'2" and 200 pounds, and 4 defensemen or 5 defensemen that were 205 pounds plus. And I remember they pounded Moncton, and so and I remember sitting in on the coaches' meetings, and we had discussions about whether or not you should call illegal sticks. Like, to me, that's a BS call. You shouldn't have to win that way. And there were coaches there saying, "Hey, we got to use whatever's at our disposal." So we had some interesting conversations, and I remember Alberta played Saskatchewan in the final in 05. It went into it was 3-1 for the Huskies after 2. And Clark I saw Clark. He was upstairs because he was picking the All-Star team, and he said, and I'm like, "Don't tell me they're going to spit the bit here at home in front of 11,000 people at Rexall Place." Remember, there was no NHL hockey that year, right? And so what ended up happening is Clark said, "You guys are going to come back and win the game." He goes, "Saskatchewan's going to go into prevent defense." And you know what ends up happening when you play prevent defense? It prevents you from winning. And the Bears just pounded the shots, ended up tying it in the final minute and won it in overtime. So, and that was in Edmonton that year. That was the goal of the year. Like, there was no NHL hockey. It was a big deal. It was a big event that year. So I can't remember what happened at the 08 Nationals. I don't know whether or not Western made it. I know Alberta beat lost the opening game to Moncton, and then pounded McGill, and then we needed McGill to beat Moncton, and they did. And that's how Alberta got into the final, and then ended up upsetting UNB. So this year's Bears team's pretty good. This is a good team. This is a team. I mean, they're ranked number 1. They didn't lose. They gained guys at Christmas. Everybody else lost guys. But that program has an expectation level, right? Of, they dominate the West, get the best WHL recruits. They really only recruit out of the Western League. Hardly ever get an OHL kid, but they're a strong program.
Well, and that's just the Western Canadian. Like, it's like, a lot of the, talking about, when it comes to football and stuff like that. And I know this past year, Western playing Saskatchewan, the Vanier Cup, and there was that conversation about, how far do Saskatchewan kids go from anything to do with Saskatchewan? And the answer is probably not a whole lot. So same scenario there, obviously, on the junior front, where, where are you going to stay? Probably somewhere either, if you can stay closer to home for junior, and then at the same point get the opportunity to make the bump up to the U Sport level afterwards. That's just the way that the culture of the game goes in that vicinity, right?
Well, the one thing that happened with football is they put a cap on age, right? So the Canada West, as an example, 95 to 98, 3 different Canada West schools won the Vanier Cup. They won 4 straight, and I think Western got beaten at least one of them, maybe in the 98 championship. Does that sound about right? Maybe they lost to Saskatchewan.
Numbers sound right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm just, I know that at that time you could play 5 years of junior football in the Prairie Football Conference, which was by far the strongest junior conference. So you could play 18, 19, 20, 21, or whatever, 19 to 22. And then you play 5 years of CIS. Like there were literally guys on the Saskatchewan Huskies at 26, 27. And they had sandboxes on the sideline, and their kids would be playing in the sandboxes during the game. And
but a kid's playing zone.
Yeah, like a kid's playing. And Western's a great academic institution, as we all know. And most of their players are 19 to 23, and they're playing against a team that's 2 years older, which in football is, in terms of man strength and everything else, is a huge difference. But the dominance from the Canada West football schools has dropped off precipitously and been supplanted really by Laval. I mean, Laval has been running a pro program. I think they got 4 or 5 full-time coaches. So I was on at one time both the top 10 committees for football and hockey. I almost went to work for the Eskimos as their head scout in the mid-2000s, right around the time that Danny Machocha was the general manager. We talked about a scenario. They offered me a scouting position internally. It wasn't going to make sense. And frankly, there's better opportunities in hockey long-term.
Now, as far as that goes, take us through the transition piece, because usually, and I know I use myself as an example. I worked the media side of things for 10 years or so, and then I found an opportunity to come work at Western, sort of thing. And you've done the media thing, you've done the communications piece, you're working in the media side of things again, sort of thing. What's the which side have you enjoyed more? Or is it just it's the same across the board? Because I know that's the same thing I feel. I'm like, it's a similar thing day to day.
How old are you, Ryan?
35.
How old?
35.
35. All right. So I did Golden Bears starting when I was 23 until 26. Okay. So from 89 to 92. And then I worked behind the scenes on NHL broadcasts with visiting NHL feeds, coming in, doing graphics and font coordinator. And then in 99, started doing some work with Sportsnet. And because I could sell, I ended up doing Golden Bears radio again, starting in 98. And I bought the airtime myself and ended up putting the Bears hockey broadcasts on our campus radio station and selling it. We were the only sold property that was on those shows. And then that morphed into the SID position. Okay. And then in 2002, the All Sports station came to me and said, we'll give you an afternoon. If you can sell campus radio, you can sell a commercial AM station if you're hosting the show. And so I started doing that in 2003. So for 5 years, from then until 2008, I was double dipping. I had what started off initially as a 5 to 7 show that became a 2 to 6 show. And I was the SID at the U of A, and I was doing play-by-play of hockey and football. And I had a column in the Edmonton Sun. So I was a busy guy. I wish I could have talked more about U of A, but the reality of the situation is in Edmonton, it's 90% orders all the time. CFL's fallen off quite a bit here. They're trying to rebuild their brand a little. And then the junior team came in 2005, which changed the complexion of things with the Edmonton Oil Kings, who, Ryan, have an unbelievable team. Like, they have 5 world junior players on it. They have 4 first-round draft choices. They've basically played the last month without their Jake Neighbors, a first-round draft choice of St. Louis, and a guy named Caden Gooley, first-round draft choice of the Montreal Canadiens. They got Sebastian Cossa, you're a Red Wings fan. He's a first-round pick and goal. And a guy named Dylan Gunther, who's Arizona's first-round pick. He's a 40-goal scorer. They are loaded. That's as good a WHL team since Edmonton, who were the last WHL team to win the Memorial Cup 2014. So Draisaitl was on a good team in Kelowna in 2015. The OHL is the best league. There's no question. There's 20 teams for 14.4 million people in Ontario. There's 20 teams. There's 22 WHL teams for 9 million people in Western Canada. Big difference. And I grew up in a time when the WHL had 8 to 12 teams. I led my midget AA team on scoring, and I wasn't close to making the WHL as a 17-year-old. Not even close. My center's the head coach at Penn State, Guy Godowski. We laugh about it now. We're like, today there's 22 teams in the WHL. The league's nowhere near as good as it used to be. But Edmonton's team this year is stupid good. It's as good a team on paper as probably 20 years in the Western League.
And is it the age-old scenario, as people have said in the past, that Edmonton fans hate Toronto fans because they're just as passionate, but people don't give them the credit for it, if not more passionate?
Oh, I think generally speaking, Albertans they don't like liberals from Ottawa. Okay, and they don't like Bay Street because they think Bay Street looks down on the rest of the country. There's a joke. How do you change a light bulb in Toronto? You hold it there and let the rest of Canada revolve around it. Here's the problem with that joke. It's kind of true. Like, Toronto is the most important city in the country, and Toronto is certainly the most important hockey market in the world. Toronto's had the misfortune, the Maple Leafs, of being in the wrong division and having Nazem Kadri self-destruct a couple times. There's no way they should have lost both years to Boston. Babcock's he's a great coach. He's a little old school. He's going to change. He's going to be back in the league next year, my guess is. And so no one's that disappointed not to see the Leafs. Like, it's kind of funny. Like, when I hear people in Toronto media talking about McDavid and Draisaitl leaving, those guys signed 8-year contracts. Austin Matthews signed a 5-year contract. The last time the Leafs won a playoff series, Austin Matthews was 6. The last time the Leafs won the Stanley Cup, the last time the Leafs went to a Stanley Cup, I was 1. I'm in my mid-50s now. So I don't like. It's important that Toronto's a successful NHL organization, but I think there's a perception from some that, and maybe it exists between London and Toronto a little bit too. Like Western's a top 5 academic school in the country, right? It's a great school. Like McGill, like UBC, Alberta would be the second best school in Western Canada. It's still a top 100 university in the world, but there's just something about how some people from Toronto perceive themselves that alienates the rest of the country. And the Toronto Sports Network, TSN, right? Now that said, the basketball team and the baseball team, those are Canada's teams in those respective sports. But hockey's a different matter, and we take hockey the most seriously of anything. I just said that the OHL is the best league for the major junior leagues. It's not even close. Not even close. The most competitive kids at the youngest age are playing primarily in the GTHL. You get the best kids out of just take a look at who the best players in the NHL are. The majority have played through that system.
Well, you get a lot of the kids even from the States now that are wanting to be in the GTHL for that minor midget year, or I guess we call it the U16 year now, getting into that, opportunity to get those eyeballs. And I think OHL Cup season is upon us, I believe, if I recall correctly, for the younger group. So But for you, sort of thing, and that that obviously connection to U Sport in general, but obviously U Sport hockey, and I always love asking this question: how underappreciated is U Sport level hockey still, and how much area and room is there to gain?
The problem U Sport hockey has is that the administrators at the universities are playing a shell game of political correctness, and they're not focused on what they actually might be able to sell. At the end of the day, U of A is going to have a hockey program whether or not they have people in the building or not. Right? It doesn't really, like, I got upset 2 years ago when Alberta was the first Canada West institution to bail on playing in 2021, because to me they should have been the last bail. They should have been being exhaustive, and I knew the real reason why it happened, and that's because they'd gone over budget in previous years, and then they had real time, and not the hockey team specifically, but the athletics program. So university athletic, and again, I worked as the SID for 8 years, and I was always on budget, but I know how these things work, and there's a balance of power. The coaches have an unbelievable amount of power, especially in the court sports and in women's sports. Okay. And traditional male sports, and I'll put hockey and football in there, they don't have, it's not like early 1970s anymore. Right. So when I was the SID at the U of A, we provided the same CP style written post-game reports for every conference game that was played on our campus. Didn't matter if it was women's hockey, women's volleyball, men's, and we had great teams like Alberta, like men's volleyball just won the national title. Men's basketball, I think, is ranked 2 or 3. They're hosting this week, and the U of A is number 1 in men's. And we've had years where we've won all 3 in the same year. The only team we haven't won in is in football, because the Bears don't have the tradition of Western. And in fact, in many years, we're really in dire times from 2007 to about 2019. They were, an absolute minnow in the landscape of U Sports football. But one of the challenges that they have in terms of promoting hockey is then you get pushback even internally in your own athletics department. And I'll just say it because I don't, it's true. That's just how it works today. It's funny how it doesn't work when it comes to a rights fee to host a national championship. Like when we hosted, we were probably in for $75,000 to $100,000 in 05, 06 in those 2 years to host a men's championship in men's hockey. Well, the women's championship to host was $5. So if we're truly about equality, make the dollar numbers the same for every, women make up 53% of student bodies on campuses. Give them 53% of the money that comes in from your student fees and services. Give those to the women's programs. I think that would be fair. But then you're not doing a revenue split between all the teams. Like Western football, what do you guys draw? 8 to 10,000 a game?
Yeah, well, this year is obviously everything was sideways, but
when you have full access to fans, what are you drawing?
Yeah, it's about 8 to 10.
Yeah, so the way I look at it is give 53% of the student fees and services to the 53% of the student population that's in, that are in women's sports. But you know what? That 8 to 10,000 that comes in from Western football, that should go to Western football's program. Of course, nobody wants to see it that way, but that's personally, I look at the business case, and that's how I'd approach it. Most Canada, I would suggest most Canadian institutions, they're running athletic programs probably worth between $5 to $9 million a year. That's my guess. Maybe I'm low now. I don't know, but it used to be about $5 to $9 million a year, and I'm excluding coaches' salaries in those numbers, right? I'm saying if you've got, like in the case of U of A hockey, their student summer programs raise a lot of money. They get 2,000 fans for home. The building only seats 2,500. They get 2,000 fans. They sell a ton of beer. That money shouldn't go back to athletics. That money should go to hockey. That's kind of it. But saying that, what the money for student fees and services, that should be split based upon what your student population is. So that's one way to and I just think that it's one of the frustrations I had with is coaches had a lot of power, and a certain block of coaches could veto and ensure that certain things happen. And I found it very exasperating after 8 years to kind of we tried to be as fair as possible and equitable as possible from a sports info perspective. But when I got, at that time, 3,000 people reading a post-game story on hockey and 400 people reading a post-game story on field hockey, you have your answer for you, don't you?
I got to imagine the one thing you're getting tired of hearing this year is Edmonton needed a goaltender.
You totally switched focus there.
Well, I went sideways.
Yeah. Getting Connor McDavid was a blessing, but it also put an immense amount of pressure on the organization. I mean, the guy is the most advanced player we've ever seen, right? There's no question.
He doesn't like talking about hockey, though. But if you get him talking about football, he'll talk to you for a day and a half, won't he?
Yeah, and so they had a good goaltender in Cam Talbot, and he had a great season in 16-17. They went through a bit of a tough time in 17-18. This is the deepest set of forwards that they have, but as of today, Ryan, they're 25th in the league in save percentage. And there's two stats that define how good you are, in my opinion, in hockey, that tell the true story. And one is goal differential, and one is save percentage. So if you're like Edmonton, just had 4 teams come into Edmonton in their last 7 home games. 2 teams were minus 50 in goal differential. 1 team was minus 67, and 1 team was minus 40. So not surprisingly, the Oilers in the last 7 games have outscored teams 38-17. By the way, Detroit was one of those teams at minus 50.
Yeah,
so, beloved Red Wings.
Well, that's my favorites. My Leaf fan friends like to chirp and say, "Oh, that game we beat you 10-7," and I go, "Okay."
Expected goals of 5, I believe. That's what the actual expected goals were in that game. So it was that's how bad. Like the game the other night with the Flames, the expected goals was way higher because Edmonton just leaked chances 5-on-5. Like they did a real poor job working back to the puck. So yeah, they need a goalie. They might have one. The best goalie in their organization might be a guy named Stuart Skinner, who played for the same athletic club that I did growing up, Southside Athletic Club, but he's in the minors right now. He's got a .920 save percentage. I think he's 15-3-4 something this year, and he's at .913 in the NHL this season. So he's at a good, and he'll be on the team next year. But right now, it's Mikko Koskinen's job to lose, and we'll see what he does.
And the other thing, too, is that you mentioned it earlier about the people saying, is McDavid and Draisaitl going to get annoyed and want to leave eventually or whatever? McDavid's a dedicated kid, and why would you want to go anywhere else? Is that just people just that's fodder?
No, Ryan. I think it's a legitimate point. Like McDavid is represented by Wasserman, that historically is one of the most powerful agencies in the world. I mean, the patriarch of that agency basically made Ronald Reagan the president of the United States, right? Going all the way back. And they've branched out and been very aggressive in hockey. And Jeff Jackson, who he might have gone to Western Ontario, I'm thinking, is Connor's agent. And they have influence. That's part of the business. Draisaitl is represented by Octagon, which was started up with Brian Lawton. Brian's a guest on my show every Wednesday. They just re-signed Darnell Nurse to an 8-year extension that kicks in next year, Ryan, and it's basically McDavid, Draisaitl, and Nurse's team. So they've got a window. The Oilers have lots of young defensemen coming. They need to find a goaltender, 100%. That is going to be the final piece. There's an old saying, right? Goaltending 70% of hockey. Unless you don't have it, and then it's 100% of hockey.
And how much is that enjoyment for you on obviously the show you do sort of thing? It's just dealing with that constant conversation sort of thing of when does it get to the hump and all that kind of stuff. And
well, we haven't, I mean, first of all, as a color guy, and then hosting a 2-hour daily show on top of that. I consider we had Wayne Gretzky work for our club for 4 years, right? From 16-17 till the pandemic hit. And I got to watch Wayne as a kid. I got to watch the most electrifying offensive team in NHL history growing up. And then to later meet Wayne and see Wayne treat Connor McDavid and Eric Gryba, a number 6 defenseman, and our trainer, Jeff Lang, and Bob Stauffer all the same way. told me everything I needed to know about Wayne, like what an incredible person he was. So, I was privileged to watch that era. And to be frank with you, what I'm watching the last few years with Connor and Leon's been ridiculous. For 3 straight years, like they're 1-2 in the NHL in scoring. For the criticism of Edmonton, your viewers would probably know Edmonton's second 2 years ago in the Pacific, last year's second in Canada, and tomorrow they're playing for second against LA in their division. So it's not like they've been a bottom 8 team in the league. They just haven't been able to climb into a top 8 team, into the top quarter of the teams in the NHL, and usually you need a goaltender to do it. So that's part of the equation. It just comes with the reality of the situation.
How crazy was Clark mentioned off the top that weekend game sort of thing? Are those the ones where when you're calling games, you're just sitting there kind of, and then obviously from those who haven't been at the bird's eye view perspective, it's definitely a bird's eye view perspective. You're looking down and they're going, what the heck is happening here?
Well, for the people that are online right now, I mean, you have a situation where the Oilers went 3 for 5 in the power play, killed off all 4 shorthanded situations, and lost the game 9-5. They got outscored 9-2 at even strength. I'm unlikely ever to see that happen again. Now, ironically enough, because I ended up in the protocol when we were in Chicago at the end of February, early March, I missed the first game in Calgary this year. So my last 2 games in Calgary for regular season were a 5-on-5 line brawl where Mike Smith beat up Cam Talbot, the former Oilers coach.
Yeah.
Right. And then we had this thing happen the other night. So there's been some wild games there. People get fueled up. It's a late start. It's an 8:00 start, Alberta time. So guys are drinking all day long during the game. And it was very feisty in the crowd. And Calgary's got a good team. They were the easiest bet in the world to bounce back this year just because Jacob Markstrom's a really good goaltender that had a terrible year last year for the Flames. He was a .904. So I'm a numbers guy, and I knew he was going to bounce back, and I just didn't think they'd score the way they have. But they got a good team, and they're tough. Like that said, McDavid and Draisaitl traditionally play their best games against them, and the teams are 2-2 this season. But that was a wild one. You're not often going to see games where your special teams are that good and you lose, but that's what happened that night.
How much is there was that fodder after the weekend of a potential Battle of Alberta playoff series? Is that pardon the pun?
Oh no, it could.
The flames are lighting.
I know. Like, hey, they didn't want it last year and they didn't want it the year before, but they want it this year, right? Because they weren't in that position the last 2 years, but they missed the playoffs last year. Calgary missed the playoffs in the Canadian division last year. It's crazy when you think about it. I would love for battle. I mean, there's been the Flames have only won 1, and that's when Steve Smith scored on himself, right? So the Oilers won in 83. They won in 84. Flames won in 86. Edmonton won in 88. The one in 1991 I thought was the best. It was the old schoolers would remember a movie called Rollerball. It was rollerball on ice. And it was at the height of, people talk, well, players, they don't respect each other. I call BS to that. Like, you watch that stuff in like Mark Messier elbowing Rick Natras in the head, knocking him out, and Dave Brown starting a lawnmower and Jim Kite in a fight. It was that was no country for old men hockey. Like, they just kicked the living you-know-what out of each other. That's how it was played. And the Oilers had nothing left after they got past Calgary. They won in 7, and Messier was hurt that year. So they played 5 times, and the Oilers have won 4 of the series. I'd use the same line on Western Ontario Hockey. How many national titles has Western won? Just the 1?
I should know off the top of my head, but I'll call new SID. Hold on. Let me see here. There's Clark.
Clark.
Just one national championship. One national championship.
Yeah.
That's it.
And the Flames won 1 Stanley Cup. And the joke forever, Clark, in Calgary about Calgary was, how do you spell dynasty in Calgary? O-N-E. So, you can win it once, Clark, but it's hard to win again. You know that. And
we've lost a few finals as well. Lost to McGill in overtime. Lost to UNB with an empty netter, and then obviously when we were, in 2020 we were in the semifinal against.
Yeah, you're in a good spot.
St. Mary's. Yeah. So, it's hard to win. It's hard to win everywhere. And you're alluding to some of the stuff with the Oilers, it's hard to win. Like it's hard to win in the National League. It's
even
hard to
harder
win. Hard to win at U Sport, right? Like it's hard.
Can I tell you that? And I have a theory, and I love Alabama football. Okay, love SEC football, and the smarter the school, the tougher it is to win. Sorry, it's just the truth. Like that's just which is what it amazes me about what Western's done in football. But I think that's because of the history of the program. And there was a U of A. It was Darwin Samodiak, right? Was there, and he's got he's got a connection to a guy that I know he's no longer with us, but a friend of mine, Doug McLean, who does some work on the Golden Bears broadcast. That's actually his grandfather. Wow. And again, Alberta in the 60s was a dominant U Sport, whatever it was called back then. They used to call it the College Bowl. And they won it 3 times. They won it 68, 72. They won it in 67, 72, in 1980. I know you know this, Clark. I don't know if Ryan's aware. In 1967, 68, Claire Drake coached the men's football team in the fall and the hockey team in the winter.
Yes.
And he won both championships. The Bears won the football national. That's how good of a coach he was. I tell American writers and American broadcasters that, and they're like, what? I'm like, I'm telling you the truth, that we had a coach that won national championship in football in the fall and hockey. And that's how good Alberta's football team was back in those days. But the smarter the school, like for McGill and Western to compete against UQTR and Lakehead, UQTR and Lakehead can get anybody in a school, or New Brunswick. They can get anybody in. Alberta is not, like I'd say UBC and Alberta are close in terms of the ability, but that's part of the product. And you'll never make that excuse, Clark, but that's the reality of the situation.
Well, and I think the one thing that a lot of people may not understand, who don't know the U Sport level well is, in the CHL, even in the NHL, we referenced the 11-2 Penguins Red Wings game. In U Sport, everybody's close. Like, although there's some games, Alberta won game 2 of the final, like 7-0, but 95% of the hockey games in U Sport, they're 1 or 2 goal games. Doesn't matter who you play, what position teams are in. It's tight, and I think that competitive.
Clark's Wi-Fi is going a little sideways in his office.
Obviously, UNB's done a great job. Alberta's done a great job, but it's hard. It's a huge challenge, especially here in the OUA with the scholarship.
Well, the other thing that's happened in the NHL is the salary cap, right? Like I had after Edmonton lost in the bubble in Edmonton to Chicago, they lost 2 1-goal games, and I had a couple of the Hall of Famers, not named Wayne Gretzky, reach out. They're like, "Staff, these guys will never win," and I'm like, "The hell are you talking about? You guys finished like 30 points ahead of LA in 1982." And you lost in 5 games to the LA Kings. Like the Chicago Blackhawks were 13 points behind the Oilers. And I said, you guys had 7 Hall of Fame players on your team and you lost LA. The Oilers played the Blackhawks, who've got 3 stone cold mortal locks in the Hall of Fame. Taze, Kane, and Keith. And the Oilers lost in 4 games because their goaltenders had an .850 save percentage. Like, you're sitting there calling out the character. And the guy was actually... The guy, as a result, ever since then, he's kind of like me that I said that to him, because he's like, you know what? I didn't think of it. I'm like, well, you should have thought of it, because there's no way you guys should have lost to LA in 82, especially after you beat the Canadiens in 81 and took the Islanders to 6 at the height of their dynasty. So it happens. I mean, that's sport. There's upsets I'll tell you, I did Alberta for 13 years, Clark. We won 6 national championships in those 13 years. Okay? 6. The best 3 teams Alberta had did not win.
Yeah,
and you beat one of those teams in 2001, but that team didn't show up. And then the 02 team was pretty good, but the 01 team was really good. This year's team that Alberta has is really good, and I got a guy who's probably the closest pro prospect the Bears have had in 25 years. Like, he's got a chance to be. He could play in the American League for a season and a half and be up in the NHL halfway through the 23-24 season. He's that type of prospect.
And Bob, when you talked a little bit about, sorry, Ryan, as we're chatting here, like if you look at the Oilers' lack of relative success, and when I mean that, I mean at the end of the day, they haven't got the job done while they've had Draisaitl and McDavid. You know, they've got Bob Nicholson. They've gone through coaches, different GMs, changed the players. Like, is there any thought? I know this is tough for you to answer given your position, but the leadership, like, does any of that fall to the leaders? Connor, Leon, Darnell, those guys are still young guys. Like, relatively speaking, they're young guys, right?
Yeah, like, I would say they haven't had a Lee Fogelin type that was there for Kevin Lowe, his defense partner, for Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier, right? Like, if anything, Draisaitl's a better player than Messier was at a younger age. And then, Gretzky's the generational star. Connor's the generational star. To me, when I look at the failure of the Oilers, it's the organization hasn't done enough to surround and support those players. And the other thing is the talent is distributed far more evenly in the league, right? Like, that's when there was 21 teams, the 5 bad teams that missed the playoffs, they were bad. Well, guess what? 16 teams made it back then. 16 teams still make it today, but now there's 32 teams.
Yeah.
Like, you can be a decent team and miss the playoff, right? Again, Edmonton's finished 12th and 11th overall in the league the last 2 years. They were 8th in 16-17. They probably should have beaten Anaheim in round 2. They got past San Jose in round 1. And I would just say to you, they haven't put enough. Like, getting Zach Hyman, that was an important ad for Edmonton. Great character, great guy, relentless, plays in every situation. The Oilers they've got depth at forward. They're lacking a bit on defense, but what's the one equalizer you got to have? Who's your goaltender when you guys won in 2002, won the national title?
Yeah, Mike D'Alessandro.
One stop better than what UQTR had that year, right? Game winning what? Triple overtime? Quadruple overtime?
Triple overtime.
Yeah. Right? So even for Alberta in 2005, they had a lot of pressure at home at Rexall Place. Dominated Saskatchewan in the third, but it was a 3-1 game and Saskatchewan had a breakaway, right? And BJ Boxma made a huge save and gave him a puncher's chance to win and you got to get that stop. And so I think in the Oilers case, and that's why Ryan asked a valid question about goaltending. That is, like, the last 2 years, like, they were in on Markstrom hard 2 years ago. They didn't get him. He went to Calgary. His best friend's Elias Lindholm, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's how close. If they get him instead of having Tyson Barrie and Mike Smith, they have Jacob Markstrom in goal. We might be talking about a team that went 2 or 3 rounds last year. Instead, Connor Hellebuck had a .950 save percentage in 4 games, right? They lost to the Jets.
So why didn't they do something this year? You read a lot out there at the trade. They couldn't find somebody, or they didn't have enough cap room.
Well, in the offseason, they were in on Darcy Kemper, and Arizona had him. And Arizona's head amateur scouts guy named Alan Hempel, and he drafted Connor Timmins when he was in Colorado. Mm-hmm. So I don't know about you guys. If I'm Arizona, I take Edmonton's first and not Colorado's first.
Yeah.
But they took Colorado's first because they liked Connor Timmins as the defense prospect more than the defense prospect that Edmonton offered. I won't say who he was, but I'll tell you that he played in the OHL.
Okay. Did he play in London?
No, that guy wasn't getting traded. Evan Bouchard is Larry Murphy. That's who Evan Bouchard is. He is going to play 1,000+ games in the NHL. They don't score the way they did when Larry played, but Larry Murphy had like 1,200 points in 1,600 games. Evan Bouchard is going to play a long time, and he's going to crush the Oilers in his next deal because he's not up until the end of the 2023 season, and by next year he'll take over the power play. And that power play's been first, and second the last 3 years. And he's not on the power play right now. Next year he will be. He's already leading the team in defense scoring right now. So Bouchard's not going anywhere. He's going to be a part of their future.
Same thing he did in London.
Which is what?
See, that's the downside. I spent 10 years doing the post-game show after the Knights games before coming to work at Western. So I saw a fair amount of Mr. Bouchard and his enjoyment of shooting the puck.
Well, he's got a great shot. Now, did the fans get on him? Did they want him to play tougher?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
They wanted a defenseman to play defense, and he was he needed the stay-at-home guy that would help stay back in the line so he could jump up and add to the offensive side of things. Nothing wrong with that in my book.
Brian, it's the tempo and pace that he plays with that people don't understand. he lets the puck do the work because he's smart, right? And so we get seduced and see guys running around and skating through guys and, hitting them in the sternum and knocking the crap out of guys. But at the end of the day, if you let the puck do the work, 9 times out of 10, you end up on the positive side of the ledger. The best players can process the game, and he can process the game.
Bob, we're getting close to the end here. Ryan might call for some questions, but I just had 2 coaching ones for you, given that's my background. The first one is, where's Babcock going to end up? And a second one would be, you've been around there a long time with Edmonton. Like, who's the best? Like, they've had Tippett. They've now got Woodcroft. They've had McClellan. Like, who's the best coach that the Oilers have had in sort of your tenure there?
Well, McClellan was a good coach. Pete Chiarelli was his GM. I don't think Peter liked Edmonton. Peter is from a liberal family in Ottawa. And even though Edmonton votes NDP on a provincial level, it votes conservative on a federal level. And I don't think Peter loved Boston. He went to Harvard, came out of Ottawa, married George Brancato's daughter, who was from Ottawa. And Peter gave me a lot of time personally because I demanded it, but he just did not like the market. So I think Todd was a really good coach. I think we got Hitch too late. Like, I think if Hitchcock, like if we could have got him in his 50s, it would have been a different situation. I'm going to work. So the first year was McTavish. He had a good feel for the players. Certainly was from the school that you can't give up more than you get. Mm-hmm. So he didn't like to trade chances. He got a lot out of the team in 06. He actually did his best job in 07, 08 when they almost made the playoffs. They had half the team out. Good guy. And he knew it was time to leave in 08, 09. Then we got Pat Quinn in 9-10.
Yeah.
He was already sick at that point. Like, you can see it. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I lost my dad that year. My play-by-play partner, Rod Phillips, was in his last year after 38 years. So they're all 68. And I remember I could tell there was something wrong with Pat on the plane. Like, I could tell he wasn't doing well. And he had a commanding personality, but he just didn't have the sharpness that he previously exhibited when he was in Toronto. Like, he's a bigger-than-life figure. Then we got Tom Rennie. He did a decent job for a couple of years, but he needed a contract extension. Then they elected to go with Ralph Kruger. Yeah. Ralph Kruger was he was like the Dos Equis guy, like the world's most interesting guy. He was just a different guy altogether. I remember when we hired him, I said, why are we hiring a guy from Switzerland when all they try to do is protect the 2-0 deficit, right? They were very defensive system. Yeah. He had some great concepts on the power play. Some of the teams in the league have copied it. The 5-on-3 power play where he has the 2 forwards on the end line. Yeah, behind the goal. He's the guy that brought that into the NHL. Wow. Interesting guy. And then Mac T took over from Tambellini as GM and brought in Dallas Aikens. And they wanted to change the culture, and they thought that the young players were too entitled, and it backfired at that time, right? They took the power away. Kruger had given the power to the Taylor Halls and the Nugent Hopkins and the Everleys, and Mac T and Dallas kind of took that away a bit, and they brought in Andrew Ferentz. He was just too old to be an effective leader. Yeah, because he couldn't do it on the ice. And at the end of the day, a leader still has to exhibit it on the ice first. Yeah. They had Todd Nelson as an interim coach. I think he was a good players coach. I think he could have been a decent coach. But they needed experience when they got McDavid. So that's when Chiarelli and McClellan came in. So I thought McClellan was good. Tippett, excellent special teams. Oilers were when the pandemic hit, first in the power play, second in PK. They were 30th in PK the year before. Now, the advantage that Woodcroft has is he knows their players the best of anybody that's come in. Right. Because he coached them in the minors, and he coached the best players in the NHL under Todd McClellan, right? Because he ran the power play in Edmonton when he was here as the assistant. Then he went to Bakersfield for 3.5 years, and he's younger. Yeah. Now, you can be young at heart if you're an older coach, but he's got really good communication skills. So good. It would not surprise me if the best choice turned out to be the least expensive. Yeah. And was the most organic. And so he's 14-7-2. I don't think it's the dead cat bounce. I think the team forechecks differently, with the exception of the game the other night in Calgary. That was just a crap show.
Well, that the bounce back last night against Phoenix showed something to me. I think that they're playing for the guy, right? They didn't focus on the Calgary loss. They bounced back,
Yeah.
played a good game last night. Oh, how about Babcock? Where do you think he ends up? Before I let Ryan finish up here.
I don't think he's as bad a guy as he's been made out to be in the Toronto market. I got to tell you that. Like I've had a couple very animated conversations with him over. I'm an opinionated guy, right? Like
Yes.
I didn't always get along with Mike Sarant. I hated how Mike's teams played, and I told him that.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're more disciplined now, but they used to always have a couple guys that didn't belong in university hockey on their team. It's nothing I hate more than 5'11" guys that rack up 300 minutes in junior A that aren't tough enough to play in the WHL that are suddenly courageous when they come to university hockey. I didn't like that about Mike's teams. He had a couple guys like that every year. He's been there a long time. I don't know how relevant Manitoba's program is anymore. And I think Mike's a decent guy, but I just hated that he'd always have. We'd go in there and it was just undisciplined. In Bab's case, I think he's a pretty good coach. And I think he's gotten a little bit of a unfair negative rap. Like he took over from Adolf in Saskatchewan and in Lethbridge and won a national title. That is like winning an NCAA football title at Savannah State. It's impossible to win in Lethbridge. Mm-hmm. Like you don't get any players there. That's the greatest coaching. I mean, I know he won a Stanley Cup for the Red Wings and 2 Olympic gold medals, but it's Canada in hockey in the Olympics. Like you got half the best players in the world on your team. Yeah. You win at Lethbridge in hockey, you can coach, So, and I think it also says a lot about him, Clark, that he went back to U Sports to coach.
Yeah, sure it does.
He could have just collected his money and lived in Arizona or lived in California or, gone to Montana or wherever, right? And instead he elected to go to Saskatchewan and mentor some young coaches and didn't get paid. And to me, if I was running an NHL team and I wanted an experienced coach, I'd obviously work out, I know that there was some stuff that allegedly happened with Marner. Part of the reason why there is the criticism of him to the degree that he is because he's dismissive at times of the media. And I got news for you. Sometimes the media, they deserve to be dismissed with some of the takes that they have on things. Mm-hmm. So I think he's a really good coach. I think technically his teams were really well prepared. And if not for Nazem Kadri, and you've got Maple Leaf fans listening to us right now, watching this, if not for Nazem Kadri, they should have beat Boston at least once, maybe twice, maybe both years. So, and Nazem Kadri's a hell of a player, but he's got to keep his head in the game, and he didn't.
Yeah. All right, Ryan, I'll let you finish up. We're at the hour mark.
At the hour mark, and I figured we'll just finish it up with a sheer look forward sort of situation to what the next few weeks, and obviously we're on the doorstep of playoff season for the Oilers. What are you seeing for this group as we go down the line?
Clark, I got a question for you. Who's winning the University Cup? It's this week.
Well, that's tough to say since I've only seen 3 I've only seen one of the Ontario teams this year, so it's hard to predict. I have to go with the defensive side and UNB probably beating Alberta in the final. I think that's, as we talked on the weekend, you said Alberta's fairly offensive team, and I think that UNB's, the other side, they got pretty good goaltending, very, very good defensively. I think it'll be those two in the final, and it's a small. I mean, the rink favors Alberta because Acadia plays on a Olympic-sized rink, and they're not having the at the Metro Center, right? They're at Acadia's rink in Wolfville, so I don't know, 1,500, 2,000 fans, big ice. I think it'll be a great game. I'm going to tune in.
Alberta's played one game in the big ice this year at the U of C. They beat them 7-2. It's dominated them pretty good.
Yeah.
I don't like the way the draw ended up working. It was because they see the OUA schools 3 and 4. They had but I first see a scenario where Alberta has to run the AUS gamut. right? They're going to have to beat Acadia, and then they're going to have to beat X. And I think X is pretty well. Is Brad Peddle still coaching X?
Yes, yeah. They're close to UNB. Like they're similar teams.
And they've upset the Bears, and they've upset UNB at times when they've had, clearly, they didn't have the better players. But that team's competitive and they can defend, and they do little things to. Now the Bears beat Santa Fe in the championship game in 2018 after they upset UNB and Alberta rallied against Saskatchewan, or maybe it was 18, I think. I think Alberta. For me, it's tough to fly. Like Alberta flew at midnight 2 nights ago, got in at 1 p.m. yesterday into Halifax. Right. I just think it's going to be tough to beat 3 teams from the Atlantic. So I'll pick one of the teams from the Atlantic to win it all. I don't want to see UQTR win, just for the record. That's the one team I don't want to see win.
Yeah, well, they're a good team. I haven't seen them, but from what I've heard, they're a good team this year. Really good team.
And then in terms,
they're the best in the OUA probably most of the year.
Yeah. But now, who's the best team in the OHL this year?
That's a pick 'em, honestly. I think that there could be a lot of.
How good's Hamilton?
Sorry?
How good is Hamilton?
Seen them once. They're pretty good. I like London if they get Brochu back.
Yeah.
I like London if they get Brochu back. So Hamilton's pretty good though too. Like there's a lot of I don't know. I think just like the NHL, the first round could be really interesting in the OHL.
Yeah. Winnipeg's got a real good young team. They got 2 kids going in the first round of the draft. Mm-hmm. But again, the Oil Kings have 4 first-round draft choices. Yeah. They got the best goalie in the WHL and the best defense. Like, it's not even close in defense. Caden Gooley, who came over in a trade from Prince Albert, it's Montreal Canadiens' first-round pick. He is head and shoulders the best defenseman in the league.
Yeah.
He got in a fight, though, which he didn't need to do, and he's been knocked out of the lineup for a couple of weeks. So he'll be back for the start. And then they have Jake Neighbors, who played 9 games in the NHL with St. Louis.
Yeah.
They have 7 forwards averaging more than a point per game and 4 defensemen with 40 or more points.
Yeah.
Like they got a good team.
It sounds like they're the team to beat in the CHL for sure.
Oh, yeah. And as for the Oilers, they'll make the playoffs. They'll finish second in the division. They're playing for second tomorrow against LA. Todd's a great coach, but he doesn't have Drew Doughty. Philip Deneau's been the most impactful signing in the Pacific Division. Underrated player. And he scored over 20 goals, 54% in the face-off circle. He kills penalties. He's on the power play. He touches every aspect of the game. And that's why LA's been the biggest surprise. I thought the 3 Cali teams, LA, San Jose, and Anaheim, were going to be full-blown rebuild. And Arizona's real bad. Like, I know the Oilers won last night 6-1, but that's a bad hockey. Like, they had a little bit of a run where they scored like 35 goals in 5 games, but they're lacking depth. They've moved out. This is what happens when you fully, they're taking on bad contracts. They got 7 picks in the first 2 rounds. I think Edmonton will finish with 48 or 49 wins in the regular season. So that means they got to get 9 or 10 in their next. They've got 15 left in the regular season, and they'll be an exciting team to watch. They can score.
Yeah.
Clark, over to you to finish it up.
Well, Bob, on behalf of Ryan and our alumni and friends, I want to thank you very much for taking a good hour here tonight to chat with us. I mean, your memory is unbelievable. I know nobody with your memory, and I'm sure that goes a long way in your business. It's been really nice catching up with you here this last week. Obviously, wish you all the best with the Oilers, your show, and everything that happens. We'll be watching them close out there in Edmonton. And Ryan, I actually think this brings our 2022 Hot Stove series to a close tonight. So 5 episodes, and think very much appreciated. And I think the nice thing, Bob, too, these are online. So our alumni and friends, even if they can't make it live, they can go in and access them online. All the links are there for them. So Ryan, thanks for your professionalism and great job this year. Bob, great seeing you again. All the best here down the road.
All right. See you down the road. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Clark.
Thanks, Clark, guys.
See ya.